Hello. In this video, we'll discuss the first philosophy book I ever read, Descartes' Meditation on First Philosophy. I gave a brief introduction to him in my library tour, and I would highly recommend that video if you haven't watched already. But in this video, we'll go much more in depth. The book was published first in 1641 and is widely regarded as the foundational text in modern Western philosophy. I will summarize the book, but I'll primarily focus on his ontological argument for God. And if you don't know, an ontological argument attempts to prove God's existence by analyzing the very concept or definition of God, while a cosmological argument, on the other hand, uses observations by the universe, like its existence or contingency, to infer a first cause, whom is God, or who. The book is made up of 6 meditations in which Descartes first discards a belief in all things that are not absolutely certain, and then tries to establish what can be known for sure. But before I do that, I bought 3 more books to add to my library. I bought Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. I got more Aristotle. I got the Oregon, I don't know. It's not oregano, but and it has 6 books of all his books on logic. And after that we have Augustine on Christian doctrine. So maybe I'll make a video about these 3 books in the future. But to start with Descartes, his argument is grounded on what is predicated of God. For example, the predicate of existence is derived from the idea of a supremely perfect being, and such a being must have the predicate of being a necessary existence. Descartes often compares his ontological argument to a geometric demonstration by arguing that the existence cannot be excluded from the idea of God any more than having 3 sides can be excluded from the idea of a triangle. Therefore, the existence of God is a priori for Descartes, or it's axiomatic or known without experience. It seems it's like a counterfactual dependence by definition. For example, if one has a pair of birds, it is by definition that if there's one bird, there must be another to complete the pair. In the same way, if there's a supremely perfect being, it must have the predicate of existence, otherwise it would be a contradiction of terms. So for Descartes, the premise and the conclusion had to be a priori in his argument to strip away his radical doubt. So Descartes aimed to doubt anything that could be doubted. The idea is to strip away all beliefs that might be based on faulty reasoning or unreliable senses in order to arrive at a foundation of knowledge that is certain and can't be doubted. So he doubts things like the physical world, as our senses can deceive us with optic illusions. He doubts his imagination, as reality could be just a really realistic dream. And this is where I want to discuss his distinction between simple and composite things. Simple things are fundamental, indivisible, and self-evident, like mathematical truths. Composite things, on the other hand, are made up of multiple parts, like physical objects or sensory experiences. And they're more prone to error because of their complexity. By identifying things as clear or distinct, Descartes prioritizes simple things as the foundation of reliable knowledge and uses this distinction to analyze the structure of reality. However, even mathematics can be doubted, since there's obviously a clear possibility that an evil deity is telling him that 2 + 2 equals 4. However, he concludes that despite all these errors with senses, reality, math, and just the external world, because in general, because at the end of his first meditation, he imagines himself with as a being with no eyes or arms or senses. But as long as it's the first person experience of thinking, he exists. And he says, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum in Latin, which is the original language he was writing in. So as long as one is thinking, they exist. And he says, quote, this book right here, he says, I have convinced myself that there is nothing in this world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Doesn't it follow that I don't exist? No, surely I must exist, if it's me who is convinced of something. But there is a deceiver, supremely powerful and cunning, whose aims to see that I'm always deceived. But surely I exist. If I am deceived, let him deceive me all that he can. He will never make it the case that I am nothing, while I think that I am something. Thus, having fully weighed every consideration, I must finally conclude the statement, I am, I exist, must be true whenever I state it or mentally consider it. At first, he doubts that if he even exists, as he separates himself from his own body, like I read out loud before he inquired. Therefore, so if he was one and the same with his body or separate, that's what his question was, and perhaps like the same evil deities convincing him or deceiving him that he's alive. But like he says, as long as there's the first person experience of thought, he exists regardless of his senses, and therefore there's a distinction between the mind and the body, according to Descartes. And this is called Cartesian dualism or substance dualism, where he posits a strict separation between the mind and the body, where the mind is like a non-material and distinct from the material body, and that they interact through the pineal gland, through like a metaphysical nervous system of sorts. And he discusses it in his sixth meditation. But now he wants to now he knows he exists, but he wants to know who, or rather what he is. And like he says, quote, "But what then am I? A thinking thing? And what is that? Something that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refutes, and also senses mental or has mental images?" He goes on to give an analogy of wax to describe that our knowledge comes from our rationality rather than our sense perception. In this analogy, he observes a piece of wax, and it's on the next page after the quote I read, noting its characteristics such as shape, texture, smell of the wax through his senses. However, when the wax is melted, these sensory attributes change completely, yet he still recognizes it as the same piece of wax. This recognition, he argues, cannot come from his senses, which only perceive the changing properties, but it's from the mind's rationality, understanding that the wax is a substance that persists along those changes, and therefore certain knowledge comes from our minds. Descartes continues to distinguish between three kinds of ideas that he talks about in his third meditation, namely those that are fabricated, adventitious, or innate, which are basically innate ideas are those considered to be present from birth, which Locke would disagree with, but are considered like these to be the most reliable sources of knowledge, such as the concept of the self, God, or basic mathematical truths, as they are a priori. Adventitious ideas come from the external experiences, and they are a posteriori. And invented ideas are created by the mind through combining or manipulating other ideas. Like if you have like idea of a horn in a horse, then you can think of like a unicorn. And so how can one have the concept of eternality if no human has lived forever? Only an infinite and external thing can come up with the idea of an infinite and eternal thing. So Descartes concludes that there's something greater than him that exists, which is God. Then he assumes that if a powerful being created him, the powerful being would not create him in deception. Therefore, his reasoning, math, reality, and senses return. So he didn't begin with God to philosophize about the self. He began with the self to reach God. And God created humans as limited beings between the two extremes of perfection and nothingness. And he gave us free will to make our own decisions based on the limited knowledge that we have. And we must act on our free will whenever we have certain knowledge, as he states in his fourth meditation. I find that I am an intermediate between God and nothingness, between the supreme entity and non-entity. Insofar that I am the created of the supreme entity, there's nothing in me to account for my being deceived or led into error, but in as much as I somehow participate in nothing or non-entity, that is, insofar that I am distinct from the supreme entity itself and lack many things, it is not surprising that I go wrong. I thus understand that, in itself, error is a lack rather than independent on God, or dependent on God. Hence, I understand that I can err without God's having given me special abilities to do so. Rather, I fall into error because of God. My given ability to judge the truth is not infinite. So basically, why did God give him this ability to make false judgments? It's because Descartes says he can't really answer that it's beyond his understanding, that God sometimes does things, but there's always a perfect rationale that he might not understand behind it. So one is able to, further states that one is able to attain knowledge of God's existence by apprehending that existence is included in the idea of a supremely perfect being, as Descartes writes in his fifth meditation. But if the mere fact that I can produce from my thought the idea of something that entails that everything which I clearly and distinctly perceive belongs to that thing really does belong to it, is not that is a possible basis for another argument to prove the existence of God. Certainly, the idea of God or supremely perfect being is one that I find within myself just as surely as the idea of any shape or number, and my understanding that it belongs to his nature, that is, he always exists, is no clearer and less distinct than is the case when I prove of any shape or number that is some property that belongs to its nature. And on the next page, he gives the example of mountains having a valley between them. If there's a mountain, then there must be a valley, just like if there's a perfect being, it must have existence. So whenever I perceive to be predicated of something, it is true of that thing. Therefore, I clearly perceive that existence pertains to the idea of supremely perfect being, and therefore such a being exists. So it's an ontological argument. So if this was to be put in a syllogism, it would be premise 1, I have an idea of supremely perfect being. Premise 2, a supremely perfect being has all perfections. Premise 3, existence is a perfection. And conclusion, therefore, a supremely perfect being exists. This argument will be a hold for any attribute of God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, and eternality. And furthermore, there's a connection between all of God's attributes and his existence. So if one thinks of an omnipotent being, one is already prescribing or ascribing them the predicate of existence. And as if an omnipotent being exists, they must have the attributes of aseity or self-existence. As if it was caused by something else, they wouldn't be omnipotent. To be an all-powerful being, it must exist by its own power and not be created by another God, since that would lead to an infinite regress, which is an absurdity. His argument reminds me of Anselm's argument for God. He defines God as, quote, that than which nothing can be conceived. So if God exists in the mind, he must also exist in reality, because existence in reality is greater than existence in thought alone. Both arguments are a priori, relying on reason and logic as their ontological arguments. Both start with a definition of God that includes perfection or greatness as essential qualities, and both conclude that God's existence is not logically necessary, given the nature of the concept of God. However, Descartes' argument is more focused on predication of attributes, rather than God being conceived as the greatest conceivable thing. But the overlap between both arguments is evident. And Immanuel Kant objects to Descartes' argument, saying that existence is not a predicate or perfection, and therefore can't be included in the conception of being, as existence doesn't add anything to the concept of a thing. So therefore, contemporary philosopher Alvin Plantinga, his modal ontological argument that kind of bypasses this objection, and which his argument is like if it was in syllogism, which it is. But premise 1, it's possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise 2, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then the maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3, if maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then it exists in every possible world. Premise 4, if a maximally being exists in every possible world, then it exists in actual worlds. And conclusion, that maximally being great being exists. So how Plantinga escapes Kant's objection is by reframing the concept of existence in terms of necessary and possibility rather than simply asserting existence as a property or predicate of a being. So the claim isn't just that a being exists, but that the existence is necessary for that being. So a necessary being is one whose existence is not contingent on anything else. It must exist in all possible worlds. So Plantinga argues that if a maximally great being, if it's possibly necessary, then it must exist in every possible world because it would exist necessarily. So I want to go back to his sixth meditation and talk about his proofs of the external worlds and mind-body dualism before we finish the video. So first, he distinguishes between understanding and imagination. So he quotes in his sixth meditation. This is the last quote we have from him, I think. When I have the mental image of a triangle, for example, I don't just understand that it's a figure bounded by 3 lines. I also look at it, the lines, as though they were present in my mind's eye. And this is what I called having a mental image. When I want to think of a chiliagon, or a 1,000-sided shape, I understand that it's a figure with 1,000 sides as well, as I understood that a triangle is a figure with 3 sides, but I can't imagine its sides or look at them as though they were present. Thus I observe that a special effort of the mind is necessary to act on the imagination, which is not required to conceiving or understanding, and this special exertion of the mind is clearly shows that there's a difference between imagination and pure intellection. As for his mind-body dualism, he believes in a benevolent God who can create anything. So he can think of his existence as a thinking thing, which doesn't require a body, and God can create of such a thing if he, Descartes, imagines it. And therefore his mind is distinct from his body. As for the material world, as I mentioned previously, since Descartes feels that his senses, he feels the senses, and a benevolent God created him with the ability to feel the external worlds, the material world does exist. And thank you for watching this video. A video will only get you so far, so I highly recommend reading the actual book. It's pretty straightforward. It's written in a pretty simple language compared to most philosophy books. And hopefully I gave you enough context that will be even easier to understand. And just to wait till you get to Hume who flips a card in his head. So let me know in the comments if you have any questions and I'll attempt to answer them. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already.